Our whole biology is based around futile cycles, right? Like if you weren't able to sustain futile cycles, and again, that means like two mechanisms that in theory work against each other, you'd be dead. Ladies and gents, the subject of today's video is going to be recomping. So this is the act of, you know, it's like the holy grail, right? We want muscle to increase while simultaneously decreasing fat, right? Who wouldn't want that? It's very few people who don't. Now, the goal of this video is not to convince you that this is the approach that you should use. It's more to provide you with an idea of why it might be of use to you or a certain demographic. And what I'm going to lay out is like a framework that you could use to approach it, right? I'm by no means saying that this is the only way that you can recomp or even that this is the best way. Just this is a way that you can help use to create a blueprint, right? This is kind of how I would go about laying it out. Let's say I know nothing about a client, but I know that this is their goal. This would be like a theoretical framework with which we could approach recomping, right? So we're trying to increase our muscle mass whilst decreasing our fat. And he's thinking, well, if this is an option, why doesn't everyone do this, right? Let's talk about the downsides first, rather than just like trying to make this sound like the best thing ever. Like, why would we not do this? Well, first off, it's slow, right? Now, you know, when you're trying to ride two horses with one ass, is that this phrase, right? You're not going to make as much progress in either of those individual facets as much as if you focused on one of them individually. So at least in the short term, progress is slower in terms of both of these, right? So like, let's say you could make 100% progress in muscle gain or 100% progress in fat loss and 0% in the other. We don't really get 50-50 here. When we do a recomp, it's probably, you know, maybe more like 30 on the muscle gain and 40 on the fat loss, right? So you get like a total of say 70% as opposed to 100. Obviously those are just like completely made up figures, but you get what I'm saying, right? It's not, you don't get the amount of progress you could make half it and get that full allotment in either. You kind of dampen both of them down a little bit. So there's that. You also have to be reasonably precise. Okay, so as you kind of see in what we're going to lay out here, you're going to have different days that emphasize different pathways and different end goals because we'd have two different end goals, which means your diet, your training, and everything's not going to be the exact same every single day, which, you know, logistically might not be possible for some people. It can also be difficult to judge. And what I mean by that is because progress is slow, it can be hard to distinguish whether you're being successful, right? Because the amount of time it's going to take you to achieve a perceptible improvement in these facets is going to be quite long. And by the time you get to that point, you may find that you've wasted your time, right? So there's a higher possibility of doing something unsuccessfully for longer without knowing. Whereas, you know, if we're going all in on a fat loss phase, if you don't make progress for 2 or 3 weeks, you can kind of see that pretty easily, right? Like your weight hasn't changed, your body shape hasn't changed, you know, whatever. Here, things are going to be happening so slow, you really can't make judgments over that shorter time frame, okay? So why might we do it? Right, what's it got in its favor? Well, I would say, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, it's very sustainable. Because progress is being made in a slow manner, we're not really pushing any individual pathway to a point where we experience a lot of downregulation. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. Like most of the things that cause a gaining phase or a fat loss phase to come to a stall are because we're not giving a balanced stimulus, right? Like for example, you're in a gaining phase. Over time, your gaining phase becomes less effective because things like insulin sensitivity drops, maybe your gut health gets worse, you know, this type of thing. Perhaps fat accumulation, you know, you get more fat than you would like, so now you have to kind of taper things down, right? Whereas with this type of approach, we end up not running into those problems because we are serving two masters at once. So it tends to be sustainable. It tends to mean that we can maintain good health. That, of course, is assuming that you're in reasonable health to begin with. And once you do get it in place, it's kind of easy. And what I mean by that is there might be a lot of groundwork to get it set up properly, get your head around it and so on. But once you kind of have a winning strategy, you can kind of just let it roll for a long period of time then, okay? So why do we all not do this, right? What is the problem here? Well, there's a big kind of misconception here. And the idea is that because it's based around kind of what we'd call a futile cycle, meaning we're aiming for two things that seem to contraindicate each other, that it can't happen or it's pointless, right? But we know it happens because we see it happen all the time. We see it in lots of contexts, right? People do lose fat and put on muscle simultaneously. So we know it's possible, right? And the reason that this can work is because our whole biology is based around futile cycles, right? Like if you weren't able to sustain futile cycles, and again, that means like two mechanisms that in theory work against each other, you'd be dead, right? So like right now, I have cyclic AMPK, which is, it's not this simple, right? But we're going to say this is the fat loss stuff, right? It goes, of course, nothing is ever this simple, but for the sake of today, and this is the hypertrophy anabolism stuff, right? Again, not strictly accurate, but let's go with it, right? Right, it's not like this turns on, this turns off. Like right now in my bicep, both of these pathways are on, but let's say because I haven't trained them in like 20 years, right? This one's most active, this one's only a little bit active, but they're both still on, but to varying degrees, right? And then maybe I trained my quads yesterday or this morning, so these pathways are much more active and these are considerably dampened down. You know, just like, you know, right now, some of your cells are going to be going through creating ATP and breaking down ATP simultaneously. You're going to be storing fat and breaking down fat simultaneously. What matters is the rate at which both of those things are happening, obviously, determines the end result of that, right? So these are the two masters we're trying to serve, but actually they're not as pitted against each other as we like to think. And actually, they're very codependent, right? So these pathways that we want to stimulate to focus on getting bigger and stronger, well, they're dependent on the environment that cyclic AMPK creates. And then likewise, if we had nothing but cyclic AMPK activity, well, then we'd waste away into nothingness. So they're very much dependent on each other, right? So let's say here, when cyclic AMPK is active, we get more autophagy, more fat oxidation. Okay, just as an example. So let's say we go through a gaining phase and we never stimulate this pathway, which obviously is impossible, right? Like, well, first off, you start to accumulate cells in your body that should be dead and gotten rid of. That doesn't happen because cyclic AMPK is one of the big drivers behind getting rid of those senescent cells. So that doesn't happen, right? And then we spend absolutely no time oxidizing and utilizing fat. So what happens? You accumulate fat very quickly. And all of that leads to, so when this works well, we see a big reduction in inflammation, for example. And we see improvements in just about every cascade that you could put under the umbrella of longevity, right? Insulin sensitivity, nutrient partitioning, all that cool stuff, right? That's what happens when we stimulate this pathway. Now, when we're over here, this is basically everything related to anabolism, right? Cell turnover, creation, so on and so forth. So like, if over here, we've got this autophagy, you've got these cells dying off over time, right? Well, at some point, we need this to create new ones. Otherwise, we just waste away into nothingness, right? Become this weak and feeble thing. So this can, in its extreme, right? We can kind of see this with some of the like longevity biohackers who are like super big on the fasting, right? They spend all their time fasting because of the benefits to these types of pathways. But if we push that too far, we end up getting actually quite weak and feeble, poor immune system, obviously not a lot of muscle tissue, so on and so forth, permanently, should we say, like depleted. like that actually ends up driving up inflammation and reducing all longevity cascades. And obviously over here, we can imagine this side of the equation being maybe like the permabulker, right? Like 6,000 calories a day forever, lots of adipose tissue, lots of inflammation, very poor insulin sensitivity and nutrient partitioning, all this type of thing. So, you know, when you are doing a fat loss phase and we're trying to bias this a lot, well, eventually we end up getting limited by this. Our performance ends up dropping. We end up struggling to recover. We actually end up usually with worse insulin sensitivity if we push cortisol and adrenaline too much, right? So eventually our fat loss phase stops because we don't have enough of this. And then likewise our gaining phase, if we push it too hard, all the insulin sensitivities start to drop, then maybe our gut gets distended and kind of gets too much stress. We need to spend time doing this. So all the things that put a hard stop on your unimodal phases are dependent on the opposite, right? So the idea very simply then is if we take a recomping approach, well then we can kind of keep these two things kind of balanced. Maybe we'll like, you know, bias one more than the other perhaps, but we can ride that out for considerably longer before we run into these roadblocks. Like I said at the start, I'm going to present like a way that you can set this up. Like I said, I'm not saying it's the only way, it's the absolute most effective way, but I just want to give you an idea of how you could go about setting this up for yourself if recomping is something that sounds appealing to you, right? Basically, what we're going to do is split our week or whatever, microcycle, you know, whatever, into days that favor one side of the equation much more than the other. So like this cyclic AMP day, you know, what we're really talking about over here is more fat loss and longevity, right? And then over here, the mTOR days, we're talking about gains, all the gains, right? Anabolism, the cool stuff, right? So what we're going to do now is have days that are heavily biased towards one so that we can stimulate them both effectively. Because what tends to not work very well is trying to do them both at the same time. Like it kind of works, but it's less effective. You're better off at least like splitting your day into one bias, okay? Like having half your day for this and half your day for that tends to not work quite so well. So what are we going to do on these days where we're biasing fat loss and longevity, right? Well, the first thing, obviously, calorie deficit and surplus is a really obvious one, right? But I'm going to look at this like outside of that scope because we can talk about that in a little bit. But let's just assume for this moment that we are eating at maintenance every day, right? Now, doing that could work. Like you could recomp eating at maintenance every day. It would be very slow, but it's totally possible. So we take that scenario where like we can't use calorie deficit or surplus to achieve our goal. What else can we use to help push the needle in either direction? So then if we look at diet over here, when we're trying to push fat oxidation and longevity more, well then what we're going to do is have a higher fat intake, a lower carb intake, and a lower protein intake. I know, God forbid, lower protein, heresy, I know, but one of the reasons we love protein so much is it drives this, and an excess of amino acids, especially the essential ones, will drive this, and then any excess then could also get converted to glucose and drive your blood sugar up, okay? What we're looking for is lower blood sugar. Generally kind of achieving the same thing there, right? So lower blood sugar, okay? Now, what we could also do on these days then to emphasize that, we could fast, for example. I'm not saying you have to, but that's one example of what we could. Obviously, that's going to keep calories and blood sugar lower. And fasting is going to kind of emphasize all of these pathways a little bit more than just being in a low calorie state, okay? So let's say on these days, we do a 16-hour fast. Something like that. You know, the typical 16-8 type thing. Okay? What else could we do? Now, when we're looking at these pathways, we're generally talking about activity performed in a lower stimulatory state, like cyclic AMPK is not going to be activated by like doing HIIT, for example. Not that HIIT is bad, but it's not. So this might be a day, the days when we bring in our low intensity steady state cardio and or moderate cardio. So modes of activity where we can still utilize fat for fuel. Okay. Now, obviously, with here for this low, we might be talking, you know, as low as 100, 110 beats per minute. And then here we might be talking 120 to, let's say, max 140 beats per minute. Okay. And what we're generally going to do on top of that is emphasize things, keep us in a parasympathetic state. Rest and digest mode, right? Okay, so this is our fat loss day. You know, maybe we're doing some weighted vest walking or, you know, elliptical, whatever in the morning. Maybe it's fasted, maybe not. Trying to keep our steps up nice and high, keeping our fat content up, carbs low, and even protein low. So like, for example, I would say if we're looking to really emphasize this over this might be a day where our protein is at something like 0.7 grams, 0.75 grams per pound. So less than a gram per pound of body weight. I know, God forbid, but you won't waste away for a single day, right? So this is going to do a lot of good things in terms of like improving our insulin sensitivity. It's probably going to give our gut a bit of a break as well. We're working on fat oxidation. You know, this could, you know, if you wanted to get fancy about it, this could be a place where you bring in tools to improve lipolysis and fat oxidation. It could be something like injectable L-carnitine, could be players like 5-amino 1-MQ, something like that. There's 1,000 options there, right? I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too much. Okay, so these are our cyclic AMPK fat loss days, right? Now, what about the fun days, right? The interesting days, now the mTOR days. So now we're going to see basically the complete reverse. Again, imagine we're stuck at maintenance, at least for now. So we're going to bring that fat content way down. We're going to increase the carbs and increase the protein significantly, right? So carbs are going to help stimulate not just mTOR, but IGF and all these other wonderful things, or insulin itself, right, is anabolic. Protein is also going to do that. So now maybe our protein, I mean, you can have a lot of fun here, but this, you could literally potentially double your protein on this day, right? And I do like that now there's some cool studies coming out showing that like these much greater protein intakes are useful in people who are experienced trainees and lifters, right? So let's say on this day, I'm trying not to be too stringent with guidelines, but I know you need somewhere to plant your flag in the sand, right? Say we got our maintenance calories, we take away our calories for protein, you know, what calories are left. Here we might be like, let's say 70% of the remaining calories coming from fat, 30% from carbs, and then you flip that over here, right? So like whatever calories are left after you've accounted for your protein, you might be 30% fat here, 70% carbs there. For example, you could bias it even more the other way if you really wanted to. So what we're generally looking for here is going to be high blood sugar is not necessarily the goal, right? But it's going to happen, right? Which is going to mean we're in storage and anabolism mode primarily. Okay, so we're doing the polar opposite of fasting now. We're trying to feed the system. So this is obviously then where we're also going to do our lifting, right? Our hypertrophy and strength work. Okay, because who doesn't want to be jacked, right? Now, we're feeding the system and emphasizing all of the pathways that are going to help us put on muscle tissue, right? This might also be the day where we do any higher demanding cardiovascular work, right? So like HIIT is great, has a lot of benefits in terms of nutrient partitioning, oxygen utilization, all that type of cool stuff, but it is going to be very glucose dependent, right? And let's say we're over here in our super low carb day, your HIIT probably is not going to go very well. And it's it's not really going to be conducive to this whole parasympathetic rest and digest type state, right? Whereas like all of this day is a lot more sympathetic, right? A lot more action, get up and go type thing, right? So this might be where we do our hit. So let's say we do our traditional weight training session, then maybe at the end of the session, we do like 2 rounds all out. Could be that small, right? And, you know, for those of you who don't really know how to program hit, this is probably the easiest way to do it. Like as little as once a week, jump on the assault bike or the battle ropes are probably the best things, unfortunately, for this, right? Go. Just 100% effort until like you can barely move. That's 1 round. And then spend as long as you need recovering till the next round. And then you go do the exact same thing again. Obviously, you won't last quite as long, right? That would be 2 rounds. Like for some people, literally just that 1 all-out round can be enough for them to get a pretty good stimulus there, right? So we're putting all of our sympathetically challenging dominant stuff on this day, right? Now, and again, how would we go about supplementing this, right? Well, we want things that are going to improve our performance. So again, now we want to maybe emphasize mTOR even more. So we might add leucine in. That would pre-workout's probably the best place to put that. We might go high dose creatine, which is also going to be beneficial there for the mTOR. And then we might want to add in things that are going to be beneficial to our actual lifting performance, which for a start, could be stimulants if you wish. But maybe we're looking at something like SLUP 332 or something like that, whereas maybe over here we use BAM15 instead, which is going to be more for the wasting and energetic side of things. There's a whole bunch, right? So now we've got this kind of framework of here's what I do on my fat loss days, here's what I do on my mTOR, my growth days, right? We've divided this up. So now the decision could be, I'm going to recomp, but which one of those things is more important to you? Like, do we want to bias the muscle gain side a little bit more, or do we want to bias the fat loss side a little bit more? And again, both are always going to be slow, but you still have the room there. Well, that's where you can then play around with how many days of your week are made up of these things, right? So let's say you're someone who's got like quite an even, so you say they're quite even in terms of their goals or their importance to them, then, we might have 3 or 4 days over here, and we might have 3 or 4 days over here, right? So then we're kind of splitting our bias quite evenly between the two, but that could very easily swap over. Like, let's say you're someone who now really wants to push the fat loss side of it, but is very keen to like either keep putting on muscle very slowly or just very keen to maintain the muscle they have. Well, then you might be 5 days over here and 2 days over here, right? Now I know what you're thinking. I'm not going to only lift 2 days a week. It's not quite as simple as that, right? When we're talking about lifting here, we're primarily talking about lifting for hypertrophy, because that hypertrophy is the thing that's dependent on this, right? So what you could do, let's say you were in this scenario, right, where you want to do a 5-2 split because losing fat is considerably more important to you, but you don't want to be only lifting twice a week because, you're not a High Rocks competitor or whatever, right? Not that there's anything wrong with High Rocks. And what we could do then is like say, right, well, these 2 days a week are the days when I get my mTOR activation, right? So this is where I do my like pure hypertrophy work, right? Maybe I have like an upper and a lower, or like a modified push and pull, where it's, lots of volume, hypertrophy rep ranges and stuff, right? And then over here, then you got 5 days a week where you're fasting, but you might put in some like low volume strength work. So of that 5, there might be 2 days where you do power or max strength work, right? And this can actually be a benefit, right? Because what's going to happen is over here, blood sugar is low, cortisol and adrenaline is high. If cortisol and adrenaline is high, neural activation is high. So we come in the gym and we might do some power work, speed work, whatever, or maybe we do some low volume, like heavy singles or doubles and stuff like that. The volume of work is going to be low, so it doesn't matter so much that our carb intake and overall calorie intake is pretty low. But then we still take advantage of that low blood sugar scenario, keeping our neural activation high. So that could be Then you get a scenario where you still get to lift 4 days a week. 2 of them are done over here, and they're done in low volume for pure like neurological adaptations. And then you have 2 days a week over here, which are really biased then towards hypertrophy and like structural adaptations, okay? So that would be a way in which you could split your week up. Now, obviously, if we removed this limiting factor, we took the shackles off in that regard, then obviously you'd have a little bit more wiggle room, right? Because what you could do then is, let's say, I don't want to mess around with the number of days, but what I could do now is mess around with the severity of each day. And what I mean by that is, let's say we go with an even kind of 4 days each across 8, but I'm more interested in muscle gain. Well, then the surplus I give myself on this day might be pretty damn big, right? Lots of carbs, lots of protein. And then over here, yes, I still have half of my days are still low calorie, but over here I might have like a small surplus because I'm more concerned about driving this and maintaining my performance on these days. I don't want to deplete too much over here so that my performance drops over here. So then we might have a small, but you could also do it the other way around, right? Like you could do it, and I suppose we should probably go into like, how do I set this up in a moment, but you could flip that over then. Let's say your bias was much more towards the fat loss side. Well, you could almost do the same diet on these days and then just have like one meal, right? Like one refeed meal on these higher calorie days. And that's the only difference between the two. That would be a super easy way of setting it up, right? You've got same diet every day, which puts you, let's say, 400 calorie deficit. And then over here on your lifting days, which, 4 days out of 8, 3 days of the week, whatever, you add in, let's say, 1,500 calorie refeed meal. Obviously, that's kind of off the top of my head, right? But you understand it. It's enough to push you past maintenance into a surplus, enough to get the benefit from all of this day, but your baseline diet kind of stays the same. We got like a blueprint now for how we could go about setting this up. So I just want to give you an example of, let's say a client came to me, they want to recomp, and let's say they want to bias the fat loss side of it a little bit more. How do you go about setting that up? Because obviously, let's say you've never really worried about your nutrition at all, or you've let it go for a while. You don't really have a starting point, right? You need to establish a starting point. And what we're really talking about when we're looking at those 2 days, if you want to like simplify it right down in your head, like what am I trying to achieve on each of those days? It's a case of we're aiming for depletion and repletion. That's basically all this is. Deplete the system, replenish the system. It's that simple, okay? So let's say like we're trying to just start from scratch here. Like, how do I go about this? So let's go step 1. First thing that I would do would be, and again, this is in the context of someone who wants to recomp, but their bias is a little bit more towards fat loss, which is going to be the majority of people anyway, right? First thing is establish a deficit. So we're just going to start with one daily diet plan with the aim of putting them in a sensible caloric deficit. And, that might take some tweaks, a couple of weeks, whatever, until you find a good space there, right? You establish this. And then you get to the point of depletion. Okay, so far we haven't done any high calorie days, no mTOR days, no fun days, basically, right? Okay, it's just been normal fat loss dieting. And we get to the point where they're starting to look kind of depleted and flat. Maybe they're on the verge of their performance going down. You're like, cool, right. So we've established a good deficit, and now we've gotten to the point where we know that fat loss is probably going to start to stagnate a little bit or get slower. Now, instead of doing what we do in like a typical fat loss scenario, we would just start adding cardio, digging deeper into the calories. Instead, what we do now is we add, let's go with the simplest possible approach. We add a refeed meal. Okay? So now we've added, instead, like I said, I'm going to keep this as brutally simple as possible. So we're going to add a sizable refeed meal in once per week, ideally on a training day. Let's say it's going to be on the day of like their hardest workout or the body part that they want to emphasize the most, right? So we can bias that mTOR signaling towards that workout. So let's say it goes in on leg day, for example, and let's say that it's, again, like 1,200 to 1,500 calories. So, so if they're in a 500 calorie-ish deficit, the rest of the time on this individual day, they're like 800 to 1,000 in surplus, okay? And then we run that. And then what we do then is slowly increase output. Now that could be in the form of cardiovascular work. So let's say like maybe we're starting off with no cardio. Maybe we add in like 1 or 2 cardio sessions per week, 20 or 30 minutes. Or it could be increasing the volume of their lifting workouts. If, say, they're recovering well and they feel like they can handle a bit more, it could be that. But we put something in that increases total energy output across the entire week. Cool. And then we run that. And then we get to depletion once again, right? We get to that point where now this individual refeed meal on top of their initial calorie deficit is no longer repleting them enough to have the desired effect because the output is higher. So then, okay, guess what we do now? We add in another refeed meal. Right? And let's say this goes in on the second most important workout, which, let's say it's arm day from, I don't know, whatever. They're important to some people, so let's go with that. And again, that's going to be another 1,200 to 1,500 calories. And then we run the system again. And then we go and add output again, right? And I'm not going to like start hunching over to write down there, okay? So we go through this again. Now let's say by the time we get to that third point, right? So let's say we want to get to the point where we have those 3 refeed meals, so 3 higher days. Let's say here we're basically doing nothing. Just like our 3 lifting sessions, maybe a single cardio session. We get to here, we add in a cardio session. Cool. We get to here. Then maybe we add in a HIIT session once per week, and maybe lifting volume goes up. And then we get to the point where we end up hitting depletion again. Like we know that they're starting to look a little bit inflamed. They're starting to look a little bit flat. They're looking a bit stringy, would be a good way of putting it in terms of like, if you're looking at their progress photos or they're just telling you how they look in the mirror. Maybe they start losing a pump during their workout. And that's like, cool. Now we add the third refeed meal. So now we've established a level of output across the week. Let's say it's 3 lifting sessions, 2 cardio sessions, 1 HIIT session now, where we have enough output that we can have 3 refeed meals in a week to drive up that mTOR activation while still having these, let's say, 4 cyclic AMPK fat loss days where we still tick that side of the equation. And then we run that. And then what we can do then over time is to keep those things going is we make the fat loss days more fat loss orientated. So, then, this might be like step 8 at this point, right? Kind of like wrote this too big. Then what we do is increase the disparity. That's how we keep progress going at that point, right? So instead of having a 500 calorie deficit, which it was at the start, probably by the time we've been running this for 2 months, it isn't a 500 calorie deficit anymore. So maybe calories come down by 200 and cardio sessions go up by 10 minutes. But then we could also then simultaneously, or perhaps like the week after, depending on how they respond, these refeed meals might get bigger. Maybe once we start pushing the calories and the lower and the cardio higher on those fat loss days, then these refeed meals become 1,500 to 2,000, because the more we deplete, the more we need to replete. And those fluctuations can get more extreme as we go through, right? So that would be a way of kind of doing that kind of step by step. Start off in a fat loss phase, like just normal. Get to the point where you're like, cool, I'm depleted. I need more calories. if I'm going to continue to gain muscle and perform at a good level, right? Cool. So I add in, and again, this is one way of doing it. There's others, but I would just go add in 1 day a week. We have a refeed meal and make that refeed meal big enough that it puts you in a surplus. Run that. Couple more weeks, maybe a month even will go by where you could keep milking progress, keep looking quite full, keep performance good. And you're like, cool, well, since you're recovering well, we're just going to titrate up how much we're asking you to do until we hit this point again, where now you're starting to look fatigued, establishing some accumulative fatigue, etc. Then we add in the second refeed. Now you're looking full, you're performing well again, mood goes up, so on and so forth. We wash, rinse, repeat again. Slowly increase the output. And then we get to the point where we can add the third refeed in because we genuinely need it. And that's kind of the main point here is you're adding the calories in when you need them to maintain the level of performance and the physique at the point that you're happy with. And if you wanted to, if you're someone who wanted 4 refeeds a week, you could push this even further, right? But that 3 tends to be the sweet spot for most, especially if we're looking to bias the fat loss a little bit more. And then once we've done that and we've established the number of refeed meals, or, you know, as we were referring to in the previous section, the number of mTOR days that we want, then we can go about this. We can go about increasing that disparity so that we drive fat loss harder on this day and we drive maybe anabolism harder on this day. Or if like we're not quite getting the fat loss we want, we keep the refeed days and the mTOR days the same and we just slowly bring down that cyclic AMPK and the fat loss days. So hopefully that was useful. That was like my take at here's how you could recomp in I have no idea how long this was, right? Now, Noah asked a very good question whilst we were doing a transition here, which was, let's say you don't want to recomp, you want to do the traditional fat loss, bulking, whatever type approach, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? If you want to do that, how do you avoid running into the problems that we discussed in the first section with these things getting too out of whack, right? So we're looking to balance these two things. And that's how you can maintain your fat loss or your gaining phase, right? So how do you do that? Well, let's look at the gaining. We're going to just kind of divide it down the middle here, right? So you're in your gaining phase. What are the things that usually end up stopping a gaining phase? It's going to be insulin sensitivity, or really it's kind of nutrient partitioning, right? And also usually it's a little bit of gut dysbiosis, general health, right? So gut stress, let's put that, right? These are the two most common problems you're going to run into during a traditional gaining phase, right? So it's well, how do we work around these? Well, it's pretty simple. We kind of can just take the recomping blueprint and just water it down a little bit. So how do we maintain insulin sensitivity? Well, then let's go ahead and just have some days that are fat dominant. Okay? So we just have some days where carbs are low, like insulin is low for a while, right? The cool thing about that is what's that also going to do? So this brings down insulin. If you want insulin to be sensitive, then you probably want to not stimulate it all the time, right? This is also going to bring down food volume. Fat is denser at the end of the day, right? Very simple. So the other cool thing is then if we bring down food volume, we bring down gut stress. Okay, so this could be as simple as, let's say you're someone who trains 5 days a week, right? Pushing mTOR really hard, carbs are high, protein is high. Well, those 2 non-training days a week, that could be where you have your cyclic AMPK days, right? Which we're going to call fat loss, whatever you want, right? It doesn't matter, right? Let's say you put those in there at twice a week, right? And just because they're fat loss, whatever days, right? What they are for you is gut health and insulin sensitivity days, right? So that doesn't mean you need to do an hour of cardio and fast all day. That might just mean higher fat and maintenance. Could be that simple, right? And the other thing, which, at least is now catching on, is keep your cardio in. Ideally, ones that work on, use the fancy term, beta-oxidation, just means using fat. is the low intensity stuff. Just keep that in during your gaining phase. And then in a perfect world, do it in a state where you're actually putting everything in your favor to use fat. So like, yes, it could be fasted, it could be done on your lower carb, higher fat days, doesn't really matter. Just remember that no matter how good you are at utilizing fat, it's going to take you about, let's say 10 minutes. It's going to take you a minimum of 10 minutes to get into a proper beta oxidative state where you're actually using fat for fuel to a significant sense. So getting on the treadmill for 10 minutes, I'm not saying is useless, but for this exact purpose, it's not great. Like, you're better off doing, let's say, 2 times 40 minutes. You're better off doing that a week than doing like 10 minutes on the treadmill at the start of every session, for example. Like, all else being equal, that is going to be more effective for this exact purpose, okay? So that's what we do during our gaining phase. We keep our cardio in. We have some days where we bias fat intake and keep insulin lower on purpose, and we purposely then keep food volume lower, right? Now, for example, some of the super heavyweight guys that I'm coaching who have huge calorie requirements, right? It's not much of a way around that. Then what they do is once per week, they do a protein sparing modified fast, right? Which basically means you only eat protein for a day. You know, I think Alan Aragon's got a bunch of good stuff on this, right? If you want to look that up. So you just take like your day's protein intake, let's say it's 300 grams. Maybe you split that into like 4 meals, whatever. That's it. Like trace fat, trace carbs. Once per week, obviously on a rest day, right? That can be enough to give the gut a good break and restore some insulin sensitivity that allows you to prolong that gaining phase without really sacrificing anything in terms of the gains that you make. Most of the time they find at first they're like, not really sure I want to do that. Within once or twice, they're like, I feel so much better just for doing that. And you know, again, this could be the day we put in some of your cardio, right? So that's easy things you can do, right? Let's go over here, fat loss. What ends up stopping fat loss? Usually it's reduced dopamine, increased glucocorticoids, so cortisol and adrenaline for the most part, reduced performance, and I'm going to say depletion. Okay, so how do we go about addressing all of these? Well, the simplest one is have your refeed meals, right? Now, this is important for many reasons. Now, what we could look at refeed meals as is this. It's a dopamine hit in a good way. Now, I find refeed meals in fat loss phases have benefits beyond this, just in that, I'm not sure about yourself, but like when you deal with people who like, you know, fitness is a pretty big priority for them, we almost lose the ability to go off plan without it turning into like this fucking binge fest, excuse the French, I'm sorry, right? So sometimes actually having a refeed meal in there on purpose is actually a good thing to maintain the ability to go off plan without everything going to hell, right? So the rules that I would put in with the refeed meals are like, you get 2 plates, i.e. like appetizer and a main and a dessert. It's done with family and friends. And it's the last meal of the day. Why those rules? Well, first off, there's only so much you can eat in 2 plates, right? I'm going to assume most people are going to eat out for this, but if you're eating at home, like, you know, your dinner and like an ice cream or something, right? If you do it in front of family and friends, you're going to get a bigger dopamine hit, which is a big part of why these refeed meals are in there for a start. Also, you're going to be a lot less likely to eat 9,000 calories worth of Oreos in front of your girlfriend, significant other, children, whatever, right? And then we also make it the last meal of the day because, again, if you do kind of go off the rails a bit, at least it's the last meal of the day. There's only so long you've got to mess up. If your refeed meal is breakfast, then it has the opportunity to become a refeed day, right? So refeed meals, this is where they come in, right? But what else can we do? And again, how often you need them is going to depend on how's your performance, how you're looking, right? Are you looking flat all the time? Then you definitely need more. Maybe you need more calories, or maybe you need more frequency. How many, if we're looking at, how do we put this? Frequency versus intensity of refeed meal. Let's go with that. That's funny, right? How do you know if you need another refeed meal or just more calories, right? There's going to be a point where there's only so much glycogen and stuff you can store at once. So let's say you have your refeed meal on a Sunday, and by like Thursday, you're always looking flat. Your mood, your workouts and everything go down as of like Friday and Saturday. Well, then you probably need another one on Thursday, right? Whereas if you add calories in on that Sunday refeed and it carries you all the way through the week, then maybe you're someone who's good to go with just the one, right? Okay, cool. What else can we do to stop running into this problem? Obviously, we've got a sensible deficit, which kind of goes without saying. But then the other thing is going to be focusing on doing things that put you in a parasympathetic state. So basically what happens is you're in your fat loss phase, cortisol and adrenaline are super high kind of all the time, because that's what you need to be in a low blood sugar state and start breaking stuff down. Over time, that tanks dopamine. So we need to do things that put us in a state where all of these can come down. Now, eating carbs and eating an excess of calories is a great way to do that. But what else can we do? Now, this could be like your super low intensity cardio, like literally go for a walk, ideally in nature. Then you could look at doing things like meditation, Shakti mat work, which, you know, like the acupressure mats, things like that. Things that are just more relaxing in nature. And then what I would also say then is moderating volume, right? So obviously when we're in a fat loss phase, we have less resources available, probably not the time to be doing your super high volume 5-day-a-week body part split, right? So we need to just kind of modulate how much we ask the body to do. So moderating volume, and I would say shifting focus to performance a little bit more. Because generally what you can do is very few people really lose muscle during fat loss phases, or it's way overstated how much that happens, right? But performance can go down. Performance can go down because adrenaline sensitivity goes down. We're depleted, which reduces passive stability. Your shoulder's not as stable when there's not as much water and fat and glucose and everything else packed around it. So then we lose performance because of that. So swapping your, should we say, your training emphasis more towards performance and strength work will help obviously keep your performance higher. And it also usually means that your training volume is going to be lower. So kind of like hits it from multiple angles. So like in reality, this would be where all your volume is done. Volume and building work is done. Like over here, why are we doing hypertrophy orientated training when it's not really going to happen? This is where we do our more max strength performance-based stuff. Okay, so that's a quick add-on cheat sheet or whatever. If you want to go down the traditional route of gaining phase, fat loss phase, just little things that you can do to help elongate those phases. The main thing in your fat loss is going to be the refeed meals, honestly. It's not an excuse for you to just go out and eat donuts and say, I need it for my fat loss phase, but well-placed refeed meals can extend the possible duration and efficacy of a fat loss phase enormously. And then similarly over here, if you're in a gaining phase, then having those, the opposite of cheat days, I suppose, fat loss days, like fasting days, whatever, are going to go a long way to maintaining your insulin sensitivity and your gut health so you can keep gaining for longer. As always, thank you so much for supporting Elite FTS, and we'll see you next time.